I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories. Who hasn't? But I always figured people saw what they wanted to see, their own fears manifesting in shadows and creaking floorboards. That was before the house on Blackwood Lane. It started when my wife Jessica and I moved to the small town of Fairview. We'd been looking for a fresh start, someplace quiet where we could finally settle down. The house was old but beautiful, and the price was almost too good to be true. I should have known then. The first night was uneventful, though I barely slept. Something about the house felt off. The air was thick, heavy, as if something unseen was watching. Jessica, ever the rational one, told me I was just overwhelmed by the move. I wanted to believe her. Then, the noises started. At first, it was small things. A whisper in the hallway when no one was there. A door creaking open on its own. Jessica tried to laugh it off, but I could see the tension in her eyes. We both heard the footsteps that night. Slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. We didn't have an attic. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate, but there was nothing there. Just an old ceiling panel that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Jessica convinced me it was just the house settling. I wanted to believe her. The next day, we found the basement. It was hidden behind an old bookshelf in the study, a narrow door leading down a set of stone steps. The air was damp, the scent of mold and something else, something metallic, hung in the air. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old leather-bound books and rusted tools that looked more like instruments of torture than anything else. And in the center of the room, there was a chair, a single wooden chair, its surface scratched and worn, with deep gouges in the armrests. As if someone had been restrained there, as if they had struggled. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. But there was one corner, just beyond the reach of the light, where the darkness seemed thicker, heavier. The shadows there didn't move. They loomed. Jessica wanted to leave. I wish we had. That night, I woke to the sound of whispering, not from the hallway this time, but from right beside me. A voice, low and hoarse, rasping a single word into my ear. Run. I turned on the light, but the room was empty. Jessica was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, that's all it was. But deep down, I knew better, and things were about to get worse. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. Jessica didn't mention anything strange, and I wasn't about to bring it up. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But the basement was still there, and so was the chair. I stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand. The shadows in the far corner were thicker than before, as though they were absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. The air was even heavier now, laced with a scent I couldn't quite place. Something old, something decayed. Taking a deep breath, I stepped down. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet, rough stone pressing into my skin. As I neared the chair, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint scratches on the floor, leading toward the darkened corner. They were erratic, desperate. I wasn't alone down here. A sudden chill swept through me, and for a moment, I felt something brush against my arm. Light, barely there, but unmistakable. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Nothing. Just the same looming shadows, darker than ever. Then the whisper came again. Low, raspy. Help me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Jessica found me in the kitchen minutes later, pale and shaking. What happened? She asked, concern written all over her face. I couldn't tell her. I didn't have the words, but I knew one thing for sure. The basement wasn't just a room. It was something else entirely. And it wasn't empty. The next day, Jessica and I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Something about last night's events had shaken me to my core, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. We started in the attic, or rather, what should have been an attic. It was nothing more than a dusty, hollow crawl space with cobwebs stretched across the beams. Nothing unusual, nothing sinister. Then we moved to the closets. Jessica pulled open the door to the hallway closet, coughing as a cloud of dust billowed out. Inside were old wooden hangers, a few moth-eaten coats, and something else. A small wooden trunk. It was heavy, the iron latch rusted but still intact. I hesitated before opening it, a sickening feeling gnawing at my gut. Jessica gave me a nervous glance but didn't stop me. I lifted the lid. Inside, neatly folded, were children's clothes. Tiny dresses, old-fashioned overalls, even small shoes, each one eerily pristine despite the age of the house. The sight of them made my stomach turn. Some of the garments had delicate embroidery, names stitched into the fabric with tiny, careful hands. Lillian, Thomas, Margaret. Jessica reached down, brushing her fingers over the fabric. "These must be from the previous owners," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Then, I saw it. A tiny handprint, dark and smeared, on the inside of the trunk lid. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just dust or dirt. It looked old, faded, but unmistakably like dried blood. Jessica gasped, stumbling away. "Michael, what the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer. But I knew, without a doubt, that these clothes didn't belong to just any previous owners. They belonged to the children in the basement, and they had never left. The air around us seemed to shift, the temperature dropping in an instant. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally, creeping toward us. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, we heard it. A child's giggle, and the closet door slammed shut on its own. I jumped back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stared at the closet door, now firmly closed. The giggle lingered in the air, sharp and high-pitched, like something not quite human. Jessica grabbed my arm, her grip tight and trembling. "We need to leave. Now." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The voice, the giggle, it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to belong to a child. It wasn't playful. It was mocking, malicious. "Michael, please," Jessica begged, but I shook my head, unwilling to leave yet. The weight of the trunk and the forgotten garments pressed heavily on my mind, as if the house itself was telling me to look deeper, to uncover the truth. But I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth anymore. We backed away from the closet, slowly, as if any sudden movement would trigger something worse. The house felt alive now, shifting around us, watching us with eyes we couldn't see. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, thick and visible. The walls creaked, like the house was sighing in frustration, and somewhere, faintly, I could hear the sound of scratching. We turned toward the basement door. It was ajar. "No," I whispered. "Not again." But it wasn't the same basement anymore. The shadows seemed to pulse, as though the darkness itself had become alive, and the air was no longer just cold. It was suffocating. "Michael, what's happening?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I didn't answer. The only thing I could do was stare at the basement door, knowing that whatever was inside was calling to us, demanding we uncover the past. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking. "We go together," I said, my voice trembling but firm. Jessica nodded, squeezing my hand as we descended the stairs once more. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air growing thicker, darker. The basement, no, it wasn't just a basement. It was a prison, a place where something had been trapped for far too long. When we reached the bottom, the shadows seemed to expand, moving toward us like living creatures, crawling up the walls, closing in. And that's when we saw it. The chair was no longer alone. There, in the corner, just beyond the reach of the faint light, stood something else. Something small, hunched over, barely visible. It wasn't human, but it was too close to human to be anything else. Thin limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and its face. Its face was a pale, twisted mask of hunger, eyes wide and unblinking. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was as if time had stopped. Then, it moved. With a sickening crack, it stood up, its bones snapping into place, and it turned toward us with a slow, deliberate motion. its mouth opening in a silent scream. "Run!" Jessica screamed, and the words shattered the stillness. We bolted up the stairs, but the shadows followed us, closing in with every step. The house seemed to shift, bending with every movement, and as we reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind us with an explosion of sound, trapping us inside. I turned to Jessica, panic flooding my chest. "We need to get out. Now!" We ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The house had sealed us in. We were trapped. And then, the whisper came again, low and guttural, slithering into my mind. "You can never leave." We were trapped. But in that moment, I realized something that had been gnawing at the back of my mind for days. This house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison. And we weren't the first to be caught in its grip. I turned, looking around for any way out. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the only light now was the flickering bulb above our heads, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Then, I saw it. The family portrait, hanging crooked on the far wall. In the dim light, it was hard to make out the details, but I knew what I was looking at. The same children's clothes, the same names stitched into the fabric. Lillian, Thomas, Margaret. And then I saw the face in the portrait. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too wide, like it was carved into his face. His hand rested on the shoulder of a little girl. Lillian, I realized. But her eyes, they were empty, black, as if the life had been drained from her. I approached the portrait, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Something about it was calling to me, urging me to touch it. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. And then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. The shadows in the room weren't shadows at all. They were figures, standing just out of sight, watching us, waiting. And among them, I could see the twisted form of the creature from the basement, its eyes fixed on us. "We need to destroy it," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We need to stop it, or it will never let us go." I nodded, the weight of the truth sinking in. The house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was a prison for something far darker, something that had been waiting for us to unlock its doors. And now that we had, there was no turning back. We had to finish it, one way or another. The house seemed to grow colder as we stared at the portrait, the figures in the shadows watching us more closely now. The air felt thick, as if the very walls were breathing, tightening around us. The soft whispering continued, rising and falling like the wind, but this time I could swear I heard words. Lillian, Thomas, Margaret. The names echoed in my mind, and with each repetition, I felt the weight of something heavy pressing down on my chest. The children in the portrait, were they still here? Were they the ones who had been trapped, or was something worse at work? I turned to Jessica, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear it? The names. They're calling to us." She nodded, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's them. The children. They're not gone. They're still here. Trapped." I took a step back, my heart racing. The whispers were growing louder now, surrounding us, filling the room. Suddenly the walls seemed to pulse with life, the air shifting unnaturally. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and I could swear I saw movement, small figures darting just beyond the reach of the dim light. "Help us," a voice, high and childlike, whispered from the darkness. It was faint at first, but then it grew clearer, more insistent. "Please, help us." I froze, my body seizing in place. The voice was pure, innocent, but it carried a hint of something else, something desperate, pleading for release. I turned toward the source, but there was nothing there, only the deep shadows, swirling and twisting as if alive. "Michael, I don't think they want to be helped." Jessica's voice trembled as she grabbed my arm. "I think they want us to join them." I could feel the cold seep deeper into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. The whispers intensified, mingling with the sound of faint, eerie laughter, young voices, but there was no joy in them, only hunger.
And then I saw them. In the farthest corner of the room, just barely visible in the creeping shadows, stood three children. They were so still, their faces pale and blank, their eyes wide and empty. They looked like they had been standing there for years, waiting for us to notice them. Lillian, Thomas, and Margaret. Their clothes were the same as the ones in the trunk, old-fashioned, worn, but somehow pristine. But their eyes weren't the same. They were empty, black, like two endless pits where nothing could escape. They stared at us, their faces expressionless, their small bodies unnaturally still. "Run," Jessica whispered, gripping my arm tighter. "We need to leave." But we couldn't. Not anymore.
The children took a slow step forward, and with that single movement, the house seemed to groan. The walls creaked and shifted, and the shadows that had been lurking in the corners of the room surged forward, wrapping around the children like a cloak, pulling them closer to us. "We're here," the voice whispered again, but this time it was louder, more demanding. "We've been waiting." I could feel the floor beneath my feet tremble, the house trembling with something ancient, something old and evil. It wasn't just the children who were trapped here. The house itself was a prison, and it had been feeding on its past inhabitants, drawing them back into its depths. The children's eyes, those black, empty eyes, seemed to pierce through me, and for a moment I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't fear, it was hunger. A deep, insatiable hunger. They weren't asking for help. They were begging for us to join them, to become part of the darkness that consumed this house, to feed it with our souls. And just like that, I understood. The children weren't the victims. They were the ghosts, the shadows, the ones who had become part of the house itself. They had been taken long ago, their spirits twisted and consumed by the evil that lived here. I grabbed Jessica's hand, pulling her toward the door. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to find a way out, now." But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had sealed us in, trapping us with the children and their hunger. I turned back toward the corner where the children stood. They hadn't moved, but their eyes were following us now, watching, waiting. And then, one of them, Lillian, I think, took a step forward. Her tiny hand reached out, fingers stretched toward us, her mouth forming the words in a voice that was no longer childlike, but something much older, much darker. "Join us," she said, her voice echoing in my mind, sending a shiver down my spine. "You're one of us now." The room seemed to close in on us, the air thick with the scent of decay, suffocating us with the weight of the house's twisted history. The children remained still, their eyes never leaving us, their tiny hands reaching toward us like silent commands. We were trapped, but there was something else, a flicker of hope buried deep within me. The house may have sealed us in, but there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle, to stop the darkness from claiming another soul. But how? I looked at Jessica, her face pale, tears welling up in her eyes. She was terrified, and I didn't blame her. We both were. But I knew that if we didn't act now, we would never get out of here. The children, the shadows, they would consume us, just like they had consumed the others before us. The whispers grew louder. The children's voices blended with the sound of scratching, scraping against the walls. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Suddenly I remembered the chair in the basement, the one we had found earlier, the one with the gouges in the armrests. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was an anchor, a tether to whatever darkness was controlling this house. If I could destroy it, maybe the house would let us go. I turned to Jessica. "We have to go back to the basement, now." Her eyes widened with fear. "No, Michael. It's too dangerous. We can't go back down there." "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice firm. "It's the only way." She hesitated, but then nodded. She understood. We had no time to argue. The house was closing in, and we had to break its hold before it was too late. With shaking hands, I led her back down the stairs,
into the darkness of the basement. The children's eyes followed us, their whispers growing louder with every step. And when we reached the chair, I knew what had to be done. I grabbed the nearest tool from the shelf, a rusted crowbar, and with all my strength, I drove it into the wooden seat. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the basement, but it wasn't enough. The shadows seemed to fight back, wrapping themselves around the chair, pulling it back into the darkness. "No!" I shouted, but the shadows were stronger now. They were feeding on our fear, growing larger with every passing moment. But I didn't stop. I kept swinging the crowbar, each strike tearing into the wood, breaking the dark hold it had on the house. And then, with one final blow, the chair shattered. The shadows recoiled, the whispers fading into silence. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the door to the basement burst open with a deafening bang. We were free. But the children's laughter, soft and eerie, still echoed in my mind.